Hi everyone, my name is Katherine Shriver and I'm hosting this year's companion lecture series for the 2024 Norgard Designs Global Project. This year's project is called Honoring the Ndebele and has to do with ndebele or herringbone stitch. And so this year's first lecture is going to be all about the Ndebele people, their art practices, and some contemporary artists so that we can ground our understanding of why the stitch is called the Ndebele stitch. A quick note for today is that this subject matter is outside of my own personal experience and outside of my own expertise. So while I've absolutely done everything I can to be very well researched and make sure this information is accurate, it is very hard to find information out there in English that is not from a colonial lens or from somehow a colonial downline. I'll explain a little bit of this context, but I just want to make sure that it's understood that some of this information is very generalized and it's also from a very specific viewpoint. So just with that in mind, we'll get into it. I'll explain more as we go, and I hope you enjoy this first presentation. All right, so now that I've shared my screen, once again, this lecture is the first lecture in the companion lecture series for 2024, and it is on NdebeleArt. So just to give a quick background and the Ndebele people, who they are and where they are, Ndebele people actually includes a number of different indigenous groups that mainly live in northeastern provinces of South Africa, as well as in Zimbabwe. Ndebele speak languages that belong to the Bantu linguistic family and which are closely related to the Zulu language. Ndebele people are actually broadly split into two groups, being the Northern Ndebele and the Southern Ndebele. And it's these Southern Ndebele people who we know for their beading and mural practices and who are associated with the Ndebele stitch. The Ndebele people have been displaced several times throughout history due to war, colonization, and apartheid. And because of this, NdebeleArt practices and their other creative traditions have continually adapted to response to their changing locations and political situations. However, there is a thread of kind of traditional commonality that we'll see throughout the maybe 200 or 300 years of art that we're going to be covering. Here in this image, you can see some of these Southern Ndebele women who are selling and beading some goods here. And they're generally wearing traditional dress. They have these beaded headbands. These blanket capes, you can see better on this large doll that they're with here, has some beading on it as well. And then the real star of the show tends to be these aprons, which are covered in stunning beadwork and which feature a lot of different patterns depending on style and period in history. So you can also see here this figure is wearing some ankle hoops, and then Ndebele women also, and sometimes men, we'll see in photos, often wear neck hoops that are beaded as well. And we'll get in and see some really beautiful examples of those as we go. So the famous art practices of Ndebele are obviously their beading, but also their painting practices, and we're going to cover those first. So women, notably, are primarily the artists in the Ndebele communities. Mothers pass these skills on to their daughters, and this happens actually especially during periods of seclusion which lead up to girls' puberty ceremonies. And these are super important, and they're performed every 4 years and taken very seriously. And it's been speculated or observed that this emphasis on girlhood development that includes this kind of secluded art training time has played a huge role in the actual preservation of Ndebele art and the continuation of its practice. So beadwork, as I said, is part of the traditional regalia and fashion. Beaded pieces signal the wearer's social status and place in life, and they can also be associated with certain ceremonial and celebratory purposes. And while these are traditional, their styles do change over time to reflect availability of materials, political climate, and shifting taste. So while these are traditional, the practices as art practice, as fashion practice, and as cultural practice are all changing and dynamic. Painting practice of the Ndebele is featured on their homes, which are painted on the exterior and sometimes also the interior. And these paintings signal family identity. They function for the painter's own self-expression, and they also can be added to or changed sometimes to mark important occasions in the family and the community. Symbolic meaning is embedded into the geometry and iconography of Ndebele beadwork and painting. And you can see even already in this photo how the beadwork and the composition of the mural painting here are in dialogue with one another, and they kind of use a dynamic and cohesive visual lexicon. So Ndebele painting is part of a wider homemaking practice and is really integrated into the home. Traditionally, the most innovative and complex designs and the brightest colors were on the front of the house, and the simpler designs in earth tones were on the back. The gateway of the home was typically given the most attention with the most complex designs, and also main windows were important focal points for the composition. Sometimes faux windows were painted onto the building just to give more visual interest, and also possibly to kind of just create the illusion that there are windows on the house where there aren't. And yes, as I stated before, many contemporary Ndebele artists also incorporate painting on the inside of their house, and we'll see some beautiful examples of that later as well. So the characteristic white and black outlines of this style, as you can see here, are a hallmark of this painting style. Traditionally, these were painted using chicken feathers to apply the paint, although now, of course, many Ndebele artists use standard paintbrushes. Traditional pigments were made first from naturally colored clays and ochres that were sometimes mixed with cow dung as a medium. And these would produce earth tones like yellows, browns, whites, and pinks. And then something called washing blue, which is like a laundry household product, would help create the cool colors as you see here. So of course, contemporary artists now gravitate towards commercial pigments and bright colors. So you can see the difference here in this painting as opposed to this one from the last slide, which I speculate is either older or just simply more traditional. Unfortunately, you'll see throughout this presentation, as a side note, that I don't have captions in a lot of my photos. And again, that's just due to lack of availability. So again, I've researched thoroughly, but do please take things with a grain of salt, and you can check through all of my sources if you'd like, which are linked at the very end of this presentation. So hold on for that. But back to these paintings. So the compositions typically are painted freehand. No drawn guides or plans. They are kind of visually mapped out and like have some pre-planning done first, but there's no like drawing with pencil or kind of like under painting to go off of. So the iconography and symbolism in the geometric compositions of these paintings is densely layered. So many symbols can have kind of multiple meanings, some more straightforward and some more abstract. So triangles, for example, I found sources that said that perhaps they symbolize things like mountains, which are very important in the Ndebele landscape, and even Ndebele traditional homes, which have this peak thatch roof, as you can see here, but then have maybe a more abstract meaning as well, referencing forward movement and strength. Zigzag lines I also found could represent both lightning and the kind of like ups and downs of the journey through life. These compositions also include pictorial motifs sometimes, like animals. I've heard of light bulbs and razor blades also being common motifs, which signal modernization and political strife. And then also read that competition amongst artists kind of tends towards intricacy and complexity. So the more intricate and more complex and deep your composition is, the more skilled of an artist, or at least more of a show-off you are. So house painting can be used, as I said earlier, to mark significant occasions and milestones or life events such as weddings, childbirth, important initiation ceremonies. And so this means that the house painting kind of constantly reflects the changing status of the family and is an ongoing project. Also contributing to the ongoing nature of this, women, of course, also have to conserve and repaint their homes to keep up with weathering and wear. Significantly, these conservation strategies that they've adapted through, generations of community knowledge They have been complicated by the incorporation of modern materials, like cement additives, which cause more cracking than traditional mud plaster. And so this kind of theme of intervention of kind of outsider, foreign, and modern materials, and the demands they put on traditional way of life will be a theme as we go. And here we just have a Catholic church that's been painted by an Ndebele artist. All right, Ndebele beadwork. So beadwork features on many Ndebele objects and garments. It's most well known for its use in traditional dress, just namely the aprons, like I pointed out earlier, anklets, neck hoops, and embroidery along a lot of these blanket capes. These beaded garments, I think I also mentioned, signal the status, place, and community and phase of life of the wearer, similar to the house painting. And full dress for a married woman, by the way, can weigh up to 40 kilograms, which is very heavy and also can be, of course, very expensive considering the beads and the labor. So while this beadwork is part of Southern Ndebele tradition, I just absolutely want to emphasize that styles and motifs shift in response to changing tastes, cultural dynamics, politics, economic stability or lack of economic stability, globalization, and availability of materials, or any other reason that any sort of art practice or fashion changes for anyone else. The styles of these neck hoops here are actually like really interesting in tracing different kind of shifts for different eras. Typically, they always use the same sort of flat, singular color bead application, but they've grown significantly in width over time. And they're kind of like while they're solidly colored, the preference of color kind of shifts from era to era. So you'll see in the more contemporary photos that I'm showing a lot of these pinks and blues. And then in earlier photos, they're largely white or sometimes green and brown. But what I thought was really interesting and lovely was that, you know, in certain periods, they start to incorporate studs. So like here you can see this woman has some studs on her neck hoops. And then they've also even like incorporated other kinds of embellishment, and plastic toys notably were apparently like a 1980s fad, which I thought was really interesting and felt very appropriate. And so this is just like a way that it marks different moments in Southern Ndebele fashion and culture. But overall, as I said, beadwork compositions really dialogue directly with the painting composition. So they use a similar kind of geometric and iconographic style. And this creates just like a very like dynamic visual language from one medium to the next, but also that makes up an artistic coherence throughout the homestead and like the wider community. And like the painting, beaded iconography and material shift to reflect new materials and modernization. Again, just emphasizing that. See here, this is an example of one of the aprons. This is a married woman's apron, and it's from the 19th to 20th century. Earlier Ndebele beadwork, I think typically from like pre-1800, used a lot more beads made from white clay, but the use of glass beads expanded as particularly Czech preciosa beads became more available through colonial imports. For thread, initially, for older pieces, muscle fiber, I'm not sure from what animal, was used, but this was replaced largely by waxed cotton as it became available, as it's just a lot more durable. I want to make a note that while we know the Ndebele from the Ndebele stitch, or the herringbone stitch that we call it sometimes, you can see that they use a variety of other stitches and techniques in their beadwork. So you'll see as we go through stringing, some embroidery, which I think we have here, netting, right angle weave, I think brick stitch as well as the Ndebele stitch. So certain techniques became the hallmark of certain families, clans, or regions just because of they had higher level of craftsmanship, and sometimes it's because of their innovative approaches. So you could really start to see certain practices and certain techniques taking on or developing or just becoming outstanding in certain areas. And that's one of the ways that people can kind of identify who's made what. And a lot of the signatures of different families and regions became very pronounced and sought out. And then a note on color. By the early 1900s, beadwork was mostly white in palette. I'm going to speculate largely because of the traditional white clay beads. This meant that the demand for multiple shades of white was very high, but by the 1920s and 30s, turquoise blues, pinks, blacks, etc., kind of showed up on the market and were more frequently incorporated into the work. It's pretty interesting that tastes of people as well as availability kind of like changed the styles. So there was a note in one of my sources that mentioned how traders became very, very frustrated with the bead trade and with the Ndebele people because their taste shifted really frequently. And so what was desirable would drive the trade in a very particular way, and it was hard to keep up. But also similarly, what was available would also drive fashion. So there was this kind of like really interesting back and forth. So you can see this woman here has a lot of white beads, it looks like, on her gown. And what's interesting about her is that one of the sources, which I believe said this was like a wedding regalia, they described this as a very kind of lacy and non-traditional pattern, which was speculated to be due to European lace influence. By the 1940s, as I mentioned, more colors came in on the market. And so color palettes became more complex and patterning became more complex and dense as well. Additionally, as political violence and cultural erasure loomed larger and larger, women started to react by incorporating more imagery representing domestic stability and also like aspirational dreams. By the 2000s, some of this was reflected by attentiveness to like desirable modern technology. So like motifs of satellite dishes were apparently very frequently featured. And then very interestingly too, stylized representations of overhead planes started showing up quite a bit. And this kind of reflects the surveillance state and like the prevalence of that on people's minds. And also from the flip side, just the like lure and glamour of foreign travel on an airplane. Notably, tourist and gallery markets did become viable ways for women to earn as the tourist trade moved in. However, artists, because of this, have had to really negotiate between making new and innovative work and adhering to traditional styles, which is actually more appealing to the foreign buyers that they can make money off of. So it's this interesting kind of like negotiation for these women artists who, like, on one hand, are very interested in like doing innovative, interesting, cool work and also like making money. So this piece is an example of a younger girl's apron, and I believe, well, it's called an apron. I believe these pieces were worn on the back. And so you can see how this like beautiful fringe would like cascade gorgeously, and like all of the fading here would really play off in the movement in this really gorgeous and like playful way. So very different in tone. I also wanted to make a note here that while we're talking about these pieces as garments and as artworks, beads function in a lot of South African cultures as more than just like a creative artistic medium. Often they can be thought of across different cultures as associated with therapeutic or spiritual or even diplomatic practices. So while that was not mentioned specifically in any of my sources, which were all very anthropological or ethnographic or artistic, I just want to like plant that there so we can think about maybe like the deep importance of beads and their meaning as people are applying them for hours and hours and hours in these super elaborate, beautiful, and heavy pieces. So a little on process. Unlike the paintings, these beadworks were definitely drawn out and planned very precisely ahead of time, especially as more colors and patterns became incorporated after the 1920s. These proportions and the designs had to be very precisely calculated to not only be very symmetrical and look great and fit the dimensions of the garment, but also to accommodate for like precise bead size, which fluctuated over time and like constantly created need for recalculation about like how many beads per inch. This is finally one of those examples of the capes that women were wearing in the previous photos. So you can see here that there's like all of this here, which is all beaded. And then this cape is made out of wool. And there's even some brass bells that are attached here and some little tassels. This is another more densely beaded, beautiful example of this cape. And I believe something like this would be all endebele stitch. You can kind of see here, if you have a very big picture, that there's all of these horizontal lines, which would be the way the stitch was running, I guess. I speculate. NdebeleArt goes global. So this next section, I'm just going to shift to talk a little bit about the context through which the Ndebele art practices spread throughout the world. As I said earlier, I just think this is a very important note to understand how this information is like traveled, where it's coming from, who's invested in spreading it, and how they're framing it. So to start, from the 1950s, that's kind of when NdebeleArt became of interest on the global stage, and this ended up culminating in international attention from the art, design, and fashion worlds, especially spread through a few key photojournalistic and exhibition sources around the 1980s. I also think it's interesting that this kind of all happened in a climate where modern art and also the British Empire were sort of in shift and starting to decline. And I'll just show you here the tail of this plane right here from British Airways. And this was like a 1997 project by British Airways to start to feature international arts on their plane. And while on one hand it was not super popular by very conservative people who thought this was not reflecting Britishness, it was also critiqued for kind of having a trivializing or paternalistic or colonial spirit in relationship to international artists under colonial rule. It felt like it was kind of very tokenizing, I think, from a certain perspective, or just used as decoration, not taken very seriously, especially as political strife continued to reign. And just again, because the way this information has traveled has really impacted the research I was able to do and the way I was able to give this presentation to you, I just want to give two more really important points about the way that Ndebele art has traveled into the West and through academic sources. First, much of what we know about the Ndebele outside of the Ndebele communities comes largely from Westerners looking at just one Ndebele family and their lives in like two very specific settlements, which were also opened for tourism. So this does not mean that the information I'm giving you or the photos that I'm sharing are in any way necessarily completely inaccurate, or it also doesn't mean that like this family's artwork is in any way inauthentic at all. It does just pinpoint this is a very small view that I'm able to give you of an entire cultural group, and it's also been framed very specifically from a limited outsider viewpoint. Second, a little bit more sinister, the popular touristic gaze of the Ndebele, which is largely how it's traveled, has been seeped in an exoticizing colonial tone. This was also largely encouraged through the apartheid paradigm, which definitely benefited from promoting what was called the postcard Ndebele. So this image of like a disappearing primitive culture as like a tourist attraction, highly problematic. That said, Constance Stewart Larrabee is one of the first photojournalists who brought the images of Ndebele people circulating throughout the world. Constance was a British-born photojournalist. She lived in South Africa for lots of her life. She became very famous for the images she took there, including of the Ndebele people and their artwork. And she was also famous as South Africa's very first female war correspondent during the Second World War. These images are thought of as very important, not unproblematic, but they are one of the ways that the Ndebele culture and artistic practices traveled through into the US, into Europe and beyond, and really piqued the public interest. Second is Peter Magubane, who was born in Johannesburg in 1932. So while he's African, he's certainly still an outsider to the Ndebele tribe. However, he was a photojournalist who was famous for documenting the unrest and brutality of apartheid in South Africa. So his photographs were much more politically charged and coming from a completely different angle than Constance's. So some of his famous images come from this book, Amandebele, which was published later in 2005. And also notably, he was the first Black photographer in South Africa to have his own exhibition in 1961. So again, very different than Constance. And so we'll start to see how these different sources may have shifted public vision of the Ndebele people. Third and seemingly most influential were the photos of Margaret Courtney Clarke. Margaret was born in Nambia in 1949. She studied art and photography in Durban, Rome, and New York. She seems very famous for this book called Ndebele, Art of an African Tribe from 1968. Has a lot of beautiful photos in it, some of which I'll share with you soon. She also is looked on upon while an outsider to the Ndebele as like a fairly sympathetic person, has certainly done a lot to get involved, including co-founding the Ndebele Foundation with artist Francina Nimbande, who I'll talk about a little bit later. And the foundation's purpose is largely geared towards preserving and teaching and proliferating the health of Ndebele artwork today. So these are some of her beautiful photos, and I especially wanted to focus on some of her work because you can start to see like how captivating these images were to people who'd never heard of the Ndebele before, and also how you can start to see how these women artists are really kind of creating a total artwork between their clothing and their homestead and the kind of community around them. Here's an example of like an animal motif. This is a chicken here represented. Now, this is just an example of some of the funny things that started to happen as Ndebele art goes global and starts to capture a wide international imagination. So this is a just stunning image of the famous model Iman in front of an Ndebele home in 1992, also taken by Margaret Courtney Clarke. And it's just a beautiful image, very arresting, especially if you've never seen Ndebele art before, and I'm sure very fashionable for its time. However, you can also see that there are like undertones here of conflating Iman's Somalian identity with like a generalized, flattened, like generic Black Africanness that's highly problematic, and that it glosses over a lot of cultural specificity and also political and colonial contexts that are just like not acknowledged or done any justice here. So while Western attention did fuel efforts in some cases to support Ndebele artwork, it also fed destructive tourism, appropriation, and a generalized conflation of very different African cultures and aesthetic practices. So another source that brought Ndebele art into the European artistic main stage was this exhibition at the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris in 1989 called Magiciens de la Terre, or Magicians of the Earth. It was put on by curator Jean-Hubert Matin, and it was considered his he considered his answer to MoMA's very infamous and problematic show called Primitivism, which very problematically and offensively, frankly, framed indigenous art from all over the world as like in service to Western modernism, and none of the artists from other cultures were named or credited or even really treated as artists. Their work was kind of saw as like artifact and also as like primitive and curiosities. So Magiciens de la Terre set out to really do something very different than that. It wanted to put in together like an equal representation of Western and non-Western artists from around the world. And so one of Jean-Hubert Matin's kind of criteria was that all non-Western artists in the show were going to be named and presented as artists rather than as the anonymous craftspeople that the Primitivism show framed them as. And it also wanted to make sure that there was a perfectly equal representation of Western and non-Western artists. Here you can see This is the kind of Ndebele model house that they have featured here. And this was done by artist Esther Mlongu, who we're going to talk about next. So finally, my favorite part of this not exhibition, of this talk, is talking about the contemporary Ndebele artists. This is Dr. Esther Mlongu, probably the most famous Ndebele artist working today. I just want to start with this beautiful quote from her. I was taught to paint by my grandmother and my mother. I would continue to paint on the house when they left for a break. When they came back, they would say, "What have you done, child? Never do that again." After that, I started drawing on the back of the house, and slowly my drawings got better and better until they finally asked me to come back to the front of the house. Then I knew I was good at painting. That's such a beautiful quote and a beautiful description of a journey from a very young artist looking for approval from their teachers. So Dr. Esther Mlongu has an honorary doctorate from the University of Johannesburg. She was born in 1935 in Middelburg, South Africa, and she also has just the most impressive CV full of all of the most important art institutions globally. So I'm just going to show you a few of her paintings, which I think she's more famous for than her beadwork, but she does do both. You can see here that her paintings do play with the traditions of Ndebele painting that we've become familiar with. So we've got the strong white and black outlines and graphics. We've got really bright colors and a generalized geometric iconography. But you can, as you cycle through her paintings, you get a sense of her style and her color preferences in slightly different shapes. But here's an example of one of those razor blade motifs that I've mentioned before. So here's another really beautiful one with great use of color and really strong graphics that remind me of a lot of those house paintings. And then this one, I will say I couldn't verify very much about it, except for that it was provided for, I believe, a Guardian article by her gallery and was labeled as Esther Mlongu. It is wildly different though, but she does have a very, very broad art practice. So this just gives you a sense of the scale. They're quite large, a lot of them, though she does, as I said, she has a very broad style and she does work of many different sizes. You can see here also how beautiful all of her traditional garb that she's wearing is. She has the beaded hoops on her ankles as well as around her neck. This is a pretty special beaded hoop in that it has some really cool patterning rather than being all monochromatic. And then she has a really gorgeous heavily beaded cape as well. This is the outside of her home, which she also painted. So in 1991, Esther Mlongu became not just the first African, but also the first woman to contribute to BMW's art car series. So since I believe 1975, BMW has been collaborating with artists to make art cars, including with Alexander Calder and Andy Warhol, the usual suspects. But I think Esther's car really takes the cake here. You can see here on the inside, and I believe this is the newer model. They've been, in 2024, incorporating her artwork into a BMW that somehow changes color using AI or something. So she's still going at it and you really at the cutting edge of contemporary art in a lot of ways. And here, I love this photo because you can really see the beautiful beaded anklets. And I love that she's also got these stacked up on top of the brass and copper rings that Ndebele women wear around their legs as well. But this is just also to showcase that she's also done sneaker collaborations with Swedish sneaker brands. That was as recent as 2022. And just to showcase again a few images from her current ongoing retrospective in South Africa that is from that quote called "Then I Knew I Was Good at Painting." And so just to showcase that while she does paintings and she does beadwork, she also paints on sculpture. She has collaborated with Nelson Mandela by painting on some of his drawings. And this is an example of some of Esther's beadwork. So again, I don't have a caption and couldn't verify details on this image, but it was within an article that is linked that seemed to be in collaboration with her gallery that represents her, the Melrose Gallery. And also, of course, it has her name. This is one of her beaded sculptures. You can see she signed it with her EM signature. And the subject matter feels ever poignant. And finally, Esther has also opened a school for Ndebele girls where they learn traditional painting, but they also learn non-traditional techniques that combine painting and beadwork too. The second artist I'm talking about is Francina Namande. She was born in 1940 in South Africa, and she sells work on the global market. I found very little biographical information on her, but her work is plastered like all over the most reputable art auction sites and galleries. So she's definitely prolific. She's definitely famous. I did find out that she has 13 children and works with her two eldest daughters. This is an image of Francina painting her own house, I believe. And here she is standing outside it. So unlike Esther, Francina seems to really specialize in the house and mural painting. And this is a back view of her own home. Again, you can see, while it's still pretty elaborate and beautifully colored, you can see that kind of reflection of like how this is like slightly more subdued compared to the beautifully vibrant front. This is an example of interior home painting. So this is again in Francina's home. And you can see that like, while there's painting all over the walls, she also has an image of her own home on the inside, which is like this really beautiful, like perpetual motion of this painting, just like shifting form and being everywhere, which I love. This is one of her paintings. It's an acrylic on canvas. I couldn't verify the size of this one, but you can see how, while similarly to Esther's painting, it borrows from like Ndebele iconography traditions and kind of generalized aesthetics. It's still very different, and you can really tell between the two of them. I find that Francina's feel much more like precise and have like a very different rhythm to them. This one is 57 by 75 inches, so pretty big. And this is an image of a Catholic church that Francina painted. I believe this was taken in 1980 or so. I don't know when the church was painted. So the last artist I'm going to talk about in this presentation is definitely not of the Ndebele people. His name is Kendall Jeers, and he was born in Johannesburg and currently lives in Brussels. However, he's in this presentation because in 2010, he commissioned a group of Ndebele beadworkers to design and bead 2 aprons in the traditional Ndebele style, somewhat, for his own work in the Data South Symposium in Cape Town. So I'm going to show you these images of these pieces in the next slide so we can appreciate them. But just for some context, they were called Ritual Slip, which is possibly a little irreverent. And while they were generally controversial for like an appropriative tone and also like the labor practices around white men hiring indigenous women to make art that they then put their own name on is a little dubious. They have been appreciated for their kind of reframing of Ndebele beadwork and contemporary art lens from like a very different conceptual angle. This is the first apron, and you can see it's done in the design of the young girl's apron, or like the unmarried woman's apron with the fringe, like one that we mentioned earlier. I also want to note that Jeers has put his name on this as the artist, of course, but has not named specifically or credited the Ndebele beaters who made it. And so it's unclear. I'm not sure if this is what the beaters wanted, if they wanted to retain anonymity. but it is unclear, and I do wish we knew who they were. And here's the second apron, which doesn't look very much like ones that we've seen. And it seems to mix in like Gothic lettering as a reference and some other kind of like a very different kind of iconographic and lexical style. But nevertheless is a contemporary art reinterpretation. So to bring it back to Ndebele work, I just wanted to close on this beautiful image where you can really see some more excellent beadwork. So this is one of the apron styles that's flat in the front with some gorgeous beadwork. It's a huge, gorgeous stack of ankle hoops and a little bit of cape beaded fringe hanging out on the sides here, and then another couple of really gorgeous aprons with a lot of rich color. And so that's the end. I'm going to go through the next couple slides that just have my image sources. I know they're not super helpful when you're watching this on a video. Please do feel free to contact me at any point, even if it's 10 years after I've made this video. I am very happy to share my sources at any point. I'll move on to the next slide of image slides. You can find my contact information on my website, which is catherineshriver.com. You can find me on Instagram at Catherine Shriver is my handle, and my email is just my full name at Gmail. So please feel free if you want more, but I do encourage you to do some research. It does require a lot of cross-referencing if you're not using scholarly databases, or if you don't have a strong basis in South African indigenous beadwork to start. But there's a lot of beautiful information out there. So that's the lecture. Thank you so much for sticking through it with me. I think this was a really great one, and I was really happy to share it with you. I want to thank Sam again so much for inviting me on, and I'll see you next time.